All right, as we continue to take a live look right here outside the federal courthouse right there, I do want to bring in criminal defense attorney Eric Faddis, who is joining us live from Colorado. Eddie, we appreciate you joining us here on Live Now from Fox for our continual coverage of Day 7 in the Sean Diddy Combs sex trafficking trial.
Yes, happy to be with you.
Yeah, so I want to start with this. Right now, we'll just start with the very latest. Right now, there's testimony from a male escort. We do anticipate hearing from additional male escorts. He's kind of outlining right now, what happened during these alleged freak-offs, what his part was in terms of, how he was compensated, how he was contacted, how long these last. What is the point of hearing from a male escort when it comes to providing evidence on one of the charges?
Yeah, so the male escort testimony, and my understanding is allegedly there are a lot of them. Their testimony goes to actually a number of charges here. One charge is really transporting someone across state lines for purposes of prostitution. And so that's why there are likely questions about the logistics, the arrangements, the payments, who made these payments, what were the communications like, what was the plan going to be? Because the prosecution needs to prove that Diddy and or Bad Boy Entertainment transported these escorts, or at least some of them, or at least one of them, across state lines to engage in a commercial sex act. And on top of that, they are trying to tie it into the RICO charge as well. So RICO is criminal racketeering. We're talking about a criminal enterprise. The government has alleged that there are multiple acts of predicate offenses, which are underlying criminal actions that are in association with and usually support the larger criminal enterprise. And so the prosecution is essentially saying, hey, who did you get payment from? Because if they can find that paper trail and tie it from, an escort to Bad Boy Entertainment, that is significant evidence of the criminal enterprise engaging in criminal activity, monetarily and otherwise.
So I know that RICO, it has to do with, commercial enterprises. It has to do with organizations. Let's talk about the logistics and get down to the nitty gritty. If Cassie were the one to actually hand over the money, would that completely blow up the argument? Does it have to be from Bad Boy Entertainment? What if she was the one who handed the money and then she was reimbursed in some other way? Does that still point towards sex trafficking, racketeering, etc.?
It potentially could still point towards racketeering, but it would be a less strong piece of evidence, because what the prosecution wants to show is there are affiliates, there are assistants, there are other individuals involved, and Diddy is a rather savvy business person, at least according to most reports. So it wouldn't be surprising for him to interject kind of a middleman, some intermediary, or some other unwitting participant to kind of do the dirty work of making the payments, so that there is less of a paper trail connecting Diddy himself and Bad Boy itself to criminal activity. So if the payments came from Cassie or someone not really part of the criminal enterprise, that certainly undermines the RICO charge. But perhaps there are other explanations as to why there may have been kind of a shell game here in terms of where the payments came from and to whom they were made.
Yeah, one of our viewers who's watching us live on our YouTube stream, Shaz, did ask, what does the prosecution need to do in order to prove racketeering? And kind of to your case in point, that paper trail. What's interesting is we were also hearing from Diddy's former personal assistant, and he was talking about how he actually used his own credit card to make purchases, and then he would then get reimbursed by Sean Diddy Combs. Does that add to the RICO or the racketeering, the fact that he was then reimbursed by Diddy, or because he used his own personal credit card? Like you said, it kind of waters down, it dilutes that argument.
It does dilute it in my appraisal. That being said, the prosecution can certainly argue that, hey, Diddy put these folks up and made them, kind of do his bidding and use their own funds and stuff like that to try to cover up and hide alleged criminal activity, and then reimburse that individual from Bad Boy. That reimbursement, according to the prosecution, would be essentially tantamount or the same as Bad Boy itself making those payments. However, I'm sure the defense probably has some kind of argument that no, we were reimbursing him for movie tickets or who knows what, and so it just really mucks up kind of the already somewhat attenuated connection between the criminal activity and Bad Boy as a criminal enterprise and Diddy's involvement therein.
To the stand very briefly, only about 15 minutes, talking about, she testified that Combs demanded $20,000 from her family. And I'm reading the notes on this. She testified that she received wiring instructions, wired the money from her checking account to the Bad Boy account. But about 4 or 5 days later, the money, she says, allegedly came back. She never had conversations with Diddy, and she doesn't have a copy of the wiring instructions. So you mentioned Bad Boy. She's claiming that she was told to wire money into the funds. That money, she says, then came back to her. No doubt prosecutors, called her to the stand specifically for that, to try and tie. But does that hold any weight from what you're hearing?
In my impression, that seems to be the prosecution grabbing at straws a little bit. And the reason I say that is because, of course, Diddy and Bad Boy can engage in different contractual relationships with people that are lawful. Perhaps they reached some kind of agreement. My understanding is that the payment request was based on some alleged infidelity or something like that, which some might say, who cares? What does that have to do with RICO? That this seems to be like some kind of cheating-based monetary dispute between Diddy and Cassie's mother. Now, if there were more to it, of course, if Diddy was paying off Cassie's mother to not talk about criminal activity, then we got a problem. Diddy's got a problem. Bad Boy's got a problem. But my understanding based on the reports I read, is that it didn't quite go that far. That it was really just some kind of, negotiations between a girlfriend's mother and the boyfriend. And I think a lot of people are saying, so what?
Yeah, what we've been hearing is a lot of conversation. But again, the jury can't use conversation. They can only look at the hard facts. And that's what it really seems it's going to come down to. The paper trail, the actual receipts, if you will. Conversations aside, I mean, what one person says isn't necessarily hard evidence. When you're a juror and you're listening to days and days of these testimony, how do you weigh all of this? The judge, no doubt, will then give the final instruction saying you can't, you can't allow emotion into this. You can't allow, your own opinions or your perspective. You have to simply look at the evidence. But when it comes to all of this emotional testimony, that obviously is very powerful and potentially influential. How does a juror kind of wade through that and edit as they go?
This jury has a Herculean effort in front of them, such a massive undertaking. I do not envy them in the least, because like you said, there are going to be weeks, if not months, of testimony, items of evidence introduced, and then the jury has to go back there. These are lay people. They didn't ask to be here. They have no involvement with this case. They've got to sort through all of this and come to some intelligible conclusion in a very high stakes, public, controversial trial. And so, they're going to be instructed that, hey, testimony is evidence. Someone's testimony on the stand that can be considered, but it's not the same as some like hard piece of paper, like you said, a receipt showing payments or something like that. And one issue that could arise in those deliberation rooms is that a lot of these alleged threats from Diddy, the prosecution wants to use these to prove that Diddy made people do things through coercion. He was pressuring them in some unlawful way, making threats, that kind of thing. Most of those threats appear to be just kind of a he said, she said thing. Now, they very well could have taken place. I'm not saying they didn't. I'm just saying it's difficult. It's more difficult to corroborate and to substantiate those kinds of testimony to a jury. My understanding is Dawn Richard from Danity Kane essentially said that she saw Diddy assault Cassie, and then Diddy said, "Hey, if you tell anybody about this, you are going to come up missing." That is evocative. That's alarming. My gosh, if that happened, that's terribly problematic. But it's difficult for the prosecution and for Ms. Richard to back that up with some sort of documentary evidence, because none exists. Now, maybe that's by design on Diddy's behalf, but still, it presents a hurdle for the prosecution.
Right, because it can be explosive testimony. Again, we've been hearing very emotional testimony, but it's one person against the other. And at the end of the day, like you said, if you don't have the evidence to back it up, it doesn't really hold weight. We've been seeing a lot of star power on the stand. Obviously Cassie Ventura being the big one. There were also a lot of names, coming in from the documents, the paperwork. I did want to ask, and I promised Douglas Madre Jr., aka DJ. We've had a lot of people chiming in right here. He had a question for you. Can prosecutors also subpoena the celebrities that were named in the trial? You mentioned Danity Kane, Aubrey O'Day, who is also a member, hasn't yet been subpoenaed. But my question is, how do prosecutors decide who to subpoena and why? Obviously, there's a strategy here. It has to kind of lend itself to their case. But how does one do that? And could we expect to hear more from certain witnesses who were named in the documents?
As a former felony prosecutor, there are multiple considerations you look at in deciding which witnesses you are going to subpoena. One is whether they're cooperative or whether they really don't want to be there. Because if you got somebody on the stand who you think might be helpful, but they hate you or they hate being there, that are things in their past that could be raised, that could be problematic, that could cause the jury to be less likely to believe them. Have they made a number of statements over the course of time that may involve some discrepancies? These are considerations as well. On top of that, who presents well, who is articulate, what is their demeanor like? These are things you need to consider. But to answer the question, absolutely, the prosecution has subpoena power to subpoena for trial any of these high-profile celebrities who were named, and there were several names that came out in jury selection. Not saying that they are accused of any wrongdoing necessarily, but their names were mentioned in association with the case. We heard about Kid Cudi, the rapper, and his vehicle getting bombed or exploding. And the prosecution believes that has something to do with him dating Cassie Ventura while she was still associating with Diddy. So yeah, the prosecution could subpoena Kid Cudi, could subpoena Michael B. Jordan's name has come up. Even Mike Myers of Austin Power fame, somehow he is in the mix here. Now, again, I don't have any evidence indicating they're accused of wrongdoing, but just that they might have some association with what happened and they could potentially be called as witnesses, they still could.
Yeah, I think when you heard Mike Myers, or people did, it was like, why would he be in association? I have to wonder, again, we don't know why, but Austin Powers, Beyonce actually happened to be in one of those movies, and you have to wonder. I want to ask you about Kid Cudi, though, because there is a particular, there are allegations that he was very jealous of Cassie when she was dating Kid Cudi while, she and Diddy were not together at the time, and allegations that he then, bombed his car. If he were to be called to the stand, what would that fall under? What would the prosecution try to prove with that testimony? What is the charge that they would be looking to focus on?
That charge would be making Diddy look bad. Which is obviously not an enumerated charge, but perhaps a strategic decision on behalf of the prosecution. Now, in all seriousness, I think the prosecution believes that this alleged bombing of Kid Cudi's vehicle would support its RICO case, because RICO can be proven in terms of the predicate underlying criminal activity offenses by a number of different crimes, including arson. They've alleged kidnapping, bribery, obstruction, you name it. So I think the prosecution would essentially try to connect what happened with Kid Cudi allegedly to to the case. But the problem is, I don't know of the connection between that alleged event and the criminal enterprise. That's the potential disconnect here that could be a problem for the prosecution. You can say everything in the world to make a guy look like a scoundrel, and perhaps he is, I don't know. But they would need to connect it to the RICO charge and to Bad Boy Entertainment somehow. Now, I guess if they had witnesses who were part of the criminal enterprise of Bad Boy, who took measures to carry out this bombing of Kid Cudi's vehicle, then that would probably do it. But I'm not aware of such witnesses, and no such witnesses have yet been called.
So let's talk about the witnesses. Do you anticipate, because obviously everyone was talking about Cassie, she was, front and center. Obviously there was, time sensitive issues. She was pregnant. And so obviously the judge didn't want her to perhaps testify a little bit later on, given the legal challenges. But does the prosecution, stack their line of witnesses to favor them in the beginning, or are they going to pull out all the stops at the end? Obviously there's strategy in terms of when to call up whom, as we're taking a look so far in terms of who has already been on the stand. Are we looking at stronger witnesses further down the line? This is supposed to take 8 weeks. Or are we going to start to see it kind of peter out and not have so much of an impact when it comes to the testimony?
Yeah, this is why I say, and of course I'm kind of biased because I'm a trial attorney, but I believe trial practice is an art. And so, it really depends on your case. It depends on your own creativity and imagination, and also your objectives, which you need to accomplish. In addition to that, there are logistical and practical concerns. Like you said, Cassie was 8 months pregnant, or very, very pregnant. And so I believe the prosecution thought, hey, we have to handle this witness before others, just due to that practical consideration. That being said, it would make sense to have witnesses kind of build upon one another. And so, one way to do that would be to call to the stand Bad Boy affiliates, like they did with or at least alleged affiliates with assistant David James today, to kind of lay the groundwork to show what this organization was, who was involved in it, what kind of activities were they engaged in, what was Diddy's connection to all of that. Set the stage. A trial is a show in a way. Not to sound uncouth, but you have to capture these jurors' attention for months. And so to do that, you really have to be thinking about what is the right witness order, who is going to be compelling, and when. That being said, I anticipate that the government has likely, I don't have any information supporting this, but it would be common for the government to have immunity agreements with other Bad Boy Entertainment affiliates who will come to the stand later and detail all of the alleged dirty dealings that they believe Bad Boy engaged in terms of these predicate offenses. Some of those listed, like I mentioned, have been kidnapping, arson, bribery, obstruction of justice, you name it.
Well, it's so interesting because, I think everyone would agree it is a performance. Everyone has a role to play. Sean Diddy Combs has a role to play in terms of appearing, a certain way. The speeches, even, from the defense and the prosecution, very strategic when it comes to kind of, and you said there's, it's almost like a music performance, if you will, the crescendos, you got to ride the waves. Do you think that the strategy is to start with the emotional part, even though it doesn't necessarily prove evidence? You want to lay the groundwork for how the jury should feel, and then you kind of hammer out the evidence after. Do you see that as kind of the strategy being laid out right here?
I think you're spot on, and here's what I mean. So, yes, Cassie was one of the first witnesses. Her testimony was graphic and harrowing, and my gosh, and then you see the video, and you feel sympathy for this person. You feel for them. That it is evocative. That they are, reaching into the chests of these jurors and shaking them up on purpose in the beginning, I think, because the strategy would be, hey, let me show you what Diddy is capable of. He is capable of this alleged monstrous behavior. And so then as you get to other witnesses who are going to talk about possibly arson, kidnapping, other types of offenses, the jury is already primed to receive that and to believe that Diddy could be capable of this. And the prosecution has kind of colored the lens through which the jury is going to see subsequent testimony, including the defense case, which is going to come down the road sometime from now.
Yeah, let's talk about it. Obviously the defense is outlining their strategy when it comes to what they are looking ahead to, because you have the here and now, but of course the most important part is, when everything wraps up in the closing arguments and such. From your point of view as a criminal defense attorney, are you sitting back and saying, you know what, this is going our way? Obviously, it's not flattering to the client. But as you're looking at the evidence being presented, if you were to be, representing Sean Diddy Combs, how would you feel confidence wise in terms of how all of this is playing out right now?
I would say at this juncture, and we're already significantly, into the trial, it's still anybody's game. I don't think this is a slam dunk for the prosecution by any means. Now, of course, there is also significant evidence, certainly of domestic violence, certainly some credible and compelling testimony regarding sexual misconduct, and that we still got a lot of innings to play. We've got a ways to go on this. And so from defense side, you really have to be responsive to the evidence that has come out and also to just kind of the tone of what's going on in that trial in making decisions in terms of what you're going to do for your defense. For example, whether you call the defendant as a witness really depends on where everything stands once the prosecution case closes. And so that decision, I bet, has not yet been made, although I think it would be a perilous decision. But in terms of defense, I would be surprised if they called other sex workers, if they called bad boy affiliates. At least one of the sex workers who testified, I'm sorry, I have notes here, early on, his name escapes me. He did testify, and I have no idea if this is true, but he said that Cassie, at least visually, appeared to be into the romantic encounters that were going on. I wouldn't be surprised if defense puts on more folks to say, hey, Cassie was into this. And believe me, I'm not saying she was, but I'm saying this could be a strategy for defense that they might explore. It is that, this looked consensual to me. Cassie never said no. There were never any indications outwardly consensual, but that would be some evidence on behalf of defense to present to the jury to say, hey, look, these other people were there, and they certainly didn't see it as Cassie told it on the stand.
I mean, it's really interesting. As you mentioned, there is so much psychology that is involved. There is so much strategy that is involved. I know you have to go in just about 4 minutes time, but as we're looking right now, the testimony today, the previous testimony, looking ahead, anything that particularly stands out to you as kind of honing in on the strategy, honing in on, potential surprises, anything that stands out to you?
Gosh, one thing that struck me is, hey, look, in nearly every romantic relationship, there are ups and downs. There are times when things are great, and there are times when things are terrible. And I think both sides have done a reasonably good job at trying to use that to their advantage. The defense has shown texts from Cassie where she says, I'm ready. I'm always ready to freak off and that kind of thing. And then, she claimed that she was a survivor of sexual assault in 2018. Well, defense said, okay, but you did have consensual sex with Diddy shortly before that and about a month or so after that. And I think what it shows is just how complicated and dynamic relationships can be. And look, if it was a person can have consensual relationship with somebody during one point of relationship, and then it could be not consensual at another point. And this relationship went on for I believe more than a decade. And so I think both sides are sort of honing in on the nuances of just the ups and downs of relationships and trying to use them to their advantage. I think the prosecution has done a decent job at kind of telegraphing to the jury that, hey, even if things appear to be good at some point, all this other stuff? What about the fact that Diddy really controlled her career, controlled her contract? What about the fact that she didn't feel like she could say no to any of this and felt that she was really beholden to him and had to do what he said? Yeah, I think they've just done a good job at highlighting these very human nuances that appear in some form or fashion in nearly every romantic relationship.
So I know you have to go in just about 60 seconds time. There was a question that we posed to our viewers is whether they thought Sean Diddy Combs was going to take the stand. What's your hot take on that?
Oh, yeesh. I would advise against it at this juncture. One, because things aren't going so terrible for him yet. There have been some things that have been terrible in the trial, but there have been some wins for the defense as well. On top of that, he would just be open to so much cross-examination about just the most, dastardly stuff you can think of. And it doesn't mean that he necessarily did it, but he'd be asked about it. It would be highlighted for the jurors again. And then there are things he can't deny, including that Cassie tape, which is brutal. And so for all of those reasons at this juncture, I would say, you might want to get up there, but don't do it, bro.
Yeah. Well, good advice from you, criminal defense attorney Eddie Faddis. We know that you have to step away. We appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Live Now from Fox, and no doubt we'll be speaking with you again.
Eric Faddis, good to be with you.
Absolutely. And